With the recent 2.5 patch, we were given a beautiful and fantastic story. At roughly 3 hours long, it stands as the longest as well. With it comes much discourse around the Rover and Phrolova, especially around who did wrong and who was right. Hello, I'm Kranis, and today I'll be analyzing Phrolova, perhaps the most tragic character in the game, a warning about yearning, nostalgia, and untamed grief. Someone who is always someone else, and never herself. Let's start with her theme song. It's called The Beyond, but its lyrics hold immense depth about her character. She, in part, knows that everything she wants in life was nothing more than a fantasy, than a daydream, as the definition of reverie implies. It has this sweet and somber undertone to it. However, she pushed those feelings aside, and we'll get into why she did that within the video. However, it is important that we all recognize that Phrolova's dream was never possible, but a delusion. And yes, I will expand upon that later. It is also important that I state this now. Her realm has a rose-tinted glasses filter that's mixed with nostalgia. I may simply refer to this as a filter or a nostalgia filter. However, this is further evidence of the unattainability of her goal, that it was viewed through this reverie she held so dear. It is more poetic that only in her dreams can they ever be human. The beyond is within the Somme Noir, further proof that it is a dream, an illusion. The only time anything overlapped with reality were tacit discords, never actual people, only entities, reverberations, and nothing human. Dorothy herself isn't even human. She is someone made within it, not a person but closer to a remnant creature. However, as part of the Somme Noir, at least judging based on the surrounding landscape, there may be hope that she and everyone there can live at peace. As Rover is the Dream Walker, this means Rover can freely enter and exit. But is it not more beautiful to think that Phrolova, despite her outward disdain for Rover, holds a certain hope and fondness for his entry, return, and to enjoy her music just as he promised? Additionally, since Dorothy can exit and be near gateways, perhaps there is some minor hope for these individuals. Phrolova, of course, once lived a normal and quiet life, and more importantly, she had both of her eyes open. She had some issues with her mother, the two of them had a falling out, and she wanted to play a piece of music before she went to go and apologize to her and make amends. Here, we can already see that Phrolova is not a decisive person, nor is she emotionally understanding. A bit of fear lingers within her heart. However, she did have a much better understanding of humanity, and of life, and of the world around her. However, she has a control problem. Through various notes we see she has an obsessive desire to control her music, to have it be purely, utterly perfection. No room for freedom or genuine self-expression, no. Instead, she wants to craft something perfect to share it with everyone. This is not genuine emotion. That arises in our failures, mistakes, and our lack of perfection. Being imperfect is part of what makes us human. In fact, the mech abomination wants the same thing she does: perfection. Not only this, we see that in her delusion, she will find ways to see perfection where there is none, saying that the cracks in a statue were the perfect cracks after the statue breaks and that it is now perfect, instead of recognizing it for what it actually is. We can already see the dark seeds that would blossom into being after a devastating and utterly crushing event that happened. Although, it's important to note that Rover, and therefore the Black Shores, were completely unaware. They're supposed to get lament warnings, and according to her, an entire civilization was wiped out. The colors shown were also a common red we see with the Phraxidus, and the Grand Architect does seem to know quite a lot about her abilities. Perhaps the Grand Architect can read fortes and saw what was lingering within Phrolova. After all, fortes are based on the unconscious mind after all. Is it too far-fetched to assume that this is part of the grand plan, and not a freak accident by the lament? I have to say it makes more sense than Rover and the Black Shores being completely unaware of an entire civilization being destroyed by the lament. But it makes sense if it wasn't them. Let's also take into consideration the fact they all died here. Back in Chi-Chi village, we are told tacit discords eat humans and mimic their behavior. That's all she's doing. She's feeding them memories and covering them with her own memories of what they look like. There is no age, no growth. There is nothing human going on. Just what she thinks is supposed to be heaven. But underneath is a vast amount of suffering, madness, and despair, further amplified by the filter over the entire area, ignoring the truth underneath the reality. Of course, her goal was never realistic nor attainable. It is built upon by lies and closed eyes. Speaking of her eyes, however, her awakening is exceptionally important, as her human eye is actually her right one, but her tacit discord eye is the left one. She keeps her undead eye open, but she closes her human eye off to the world, essentially getting rid of her humanity. But more than that, this is also symbolic in Jungian psychology. In Jungian psychology, this is a symbol of a loss of awareness, be it self-awareness or of the larger world around you. Furthermore, it represents one-sidedness and a lack of insight, all things she would display in great detail in the final confrontation with Rover. Rover made a promise to her. However, the promise was to only show up when she finished her piece of music. That was it. There was nothing about showing up to every concert. In fact, the promise explicitly implies he'll never show up again until the very end. Again, another showcase of obsession and control. He understands me, therefore he'll show up, and we have a connection. Are those thoughts true? No, they aren't. To add further insight, I will talk about Rover for a brief moment. Rover, as I said in my Carl Jung video, is both the self and the ego. The player represents the ego, and we are the one who made the promise. This is why there is no voice acting despite the line being recorded. Furthermore, let's look at the contents of what Rover is even saying. Rover says that he changed himself, but has not given up his memories yet. Something people forget quite often is that Rover knew the future. Rover sees predetermined outcomes. He saw the end of the world with the shorekeeper. In fact, the end of Wandering is part of the future where Rover wins. Did Rover give up their memories out of desperation? Past Rover certainly does not give that impression, and is even guiding us. He seems more hopeful than desperate. Rover knew that one day he was going to give up his memories. Sure, there is definitely some level of desperation going on, I won't deny that. Let us also not deny that there are predetermined outcomes and events. Rover made Phrolova a promise, and he kept it. Her movement was about her life, and about those she cared deeply about. The death of that civilization, so to speak. When she fully merged with the beyond, that is when she completed her piece, and the Rover was there to witness it. She kept her promise as well. Rover can enter and exit it, even though she clearly despises Rover. She lacks the ability to self-reflect, which is her weakness in my opinion. So much suffering could have been avoided if she took a few minutes to breathe, to reflect on herself, on Hecate, on the beyond. But she didn't. She assumed it was all real, that she was right, that she had to save everyone. After all, how could the Messiah ever be wrong? How could she ever be wrong? Two people, Rover and Phrolova, who believe they are saviors of the world. However, the cruelty is that Phrolova can never be a savior. She does not get that vindication and therefore the acceptance of her actions, unlike Rover. In the end, Rover wins. All of his actions are justified. Whatever path he took suddenly becomes righteous and good. The ends justify the means, but only if you succeed. And, unfortunately, Phrolova's end was never attainable, meaning she could never succeed. Let's dive deeper into her Jungian connections, from her violin to the world she made to Hecate herself. Starting with Hecate, this is clearly her shadow. Funny enough, Phrolova has three faces. She has Hecate, her shadow, Phrolova, the mask she made, the violin, who she truly is. This is true for the Greek goddess, known as Hecate as well, with three faces. Hecate is a failed integration of the shadow. She recognized Hecate as her, not as part of her. This is further emphasized by the fact she covers her human eye. Yes, of course, it holds a lot of power. It might even be dangerous. However, that's why she should have integrated it. It would have been more stable and a symbol of hope, not of despair. She acknowledged her shadow, but she accepted it as who she is, not as part of her greater identity. She did not accept her flaws or negative aspects. She viewed everything as capable of perfection. It wasn't until after she died that she would be faced with the idea it cannot, yet she still found a way to justify it, saying the cracks were not perfect. Instead of realizing the unattainability of perfection, Hecate amplified all of Phrolova's negative traits, just like the shadow does. Her desire to control is amplified to that of life itself. People haven't died yet, but because they do in the future, they're already dead. It doesn't matter if she kills them or not because they die anyway. Some hints of nihilism in her thoughts, but I wouldn't say a full-on nihilist. She's just a broken and lost person. Out of everyone in the world, she was the one who needed Rover the most. She does not have hope, but delusion. Hope is like a lake. It's shaped, and form comes from logic, reasoning, and understanding. She lacked understanding and reason, but I can see the logic behind her words. Hope is faith, emotion, and belief, tempered by reason, understanding, and logic. Without reason and understanding, it just becomes faith and emotion, which, of course, is delusion. The line between hope and delusion is thin as the line between a shore and the ocean. How beautifully tragic it is that the rover and the shorekeeper represent one shore, but the Liquoris radiata means the other shore, in this case, the Phraxidis, almost as if she were destined to join them, destined to become obsessed with Rover, and destined to die. Cristoforo must be creaming his pants at just the thought of her tragic life. Let us move on to her persona, the Phraxidis member, the Red Witch, or simply, Phrolova. This is the mask she had to craft to get what she wanted, merciless, uncaring of life, indifferent to it all. However, we see that she still has a part crying out that life matters, even if only in brief moments with Rover. She experiments on people, and because it's so close with Hecate, she believes it is who she is, that it's all right. However, would she have ever crafted this mask if, say, the Black Shores showed up and offered a hand? It's odd, isn't it, that the Black Shores didn't extend a hand to Phrolova. Having a consultant in Renacita would have been useful. Tethys must have thought as much. However, perhaps the Rover saw her end and how she was part of the Phraxidis. Could her mask have been forced upon her by outside forces? Yes, most masks are. The violin. The violin is her in her truest self, sunken at the bottom of a deep, dark lake. She was a musician, after all. It was who she was, what she loved, everything she cared about. It was her innocence in life before death. We hear her call out for it, a broken part of her still desperate to return to who she was. However, we see that she clings to it when she sinks into the abyss. Water in Jungian psychology holds a deep meaning. It can mean the collective unconscious, for example. Of course, with all of those frequencies she took, she might as well be a hub of it, with those people. After all, it doesn't have to be all of humanity. Perhaps, in truth, she did have them as they were. However, her idea that it can be expanded to the world at large was perhaps the real delusion. The sacrifice of the ego to become the self, and in turn, she finally turned the place into something more stable. Suffering does not appear to be constant. It does not appear to be present. However, that filter still remains. She is incomplete, but she's one step closer, accepting that inner child within her, that humanity was enough to actually integrate with the beyond. The violin is a delicate, beautiful, and expressive instrument. It represents her voice, her true self, and a means of emotional expression. When she finally plays it again, she trembles before everyone comes to welcome her back, to hold her and show her love. Because she too loved herself just enough to express some minor modicum of herself, clinging to her, trying to preserve her identity and emotions. The part of her most deeply repressed was the only key she ever needed. If she let go of control, let go of obsession, then perhaps she would not have suffered for as long as she did. However, the Phraxidis tricked her, and it was beautifully well done. When it comes to her suffering, She looks like the architect of it. However, in reality, the architect of her suffering, of her life, was, of course, the Grand Architect. Even if she doesn't want to admit it or cannot see it, Rover kept his promise. Furthermore, Rover was the one who made her see this brief glimpse so that she can make her dream, in part, a reality. Sometimes to save someone, a hero has to do something that appears unheroic. People call Rover a hypocrite or Phrolova one. However, this is simply untrue. Rover has stayed true to what he believed in and what he says. Hypocrisy is saying one thing but then doing another. Do as I say, not as I do, in other words. Phrolova is a hypocrite. She speaks of her own suffering and failures, yet completely ignores Rover's. However, she also expects past Rover to be responsible for the promises. Anything that negatively affected her, he is responsible for. She doesn't view herself as doing any wrong. She kills without care because they're already dead, yet pretends to care about some life. Phrolova created an entire headcanon around the promise and then blamed Rover instead of herself. She tells people to let go of her at the very start of the quest, but she refused to let go of Rover's promise. Her hypocrisy is part of why she suffers. Rover's goal is attainable. It is realistic because we've already seen that, at least in one future, Rover has won. Furthermore, Rover wasn't driven solely by desperation, but was in fact driven by hope. Hope of finding another way, not desperate to find one. Their past selves seemed to know, or hope, that Rover would save Shorekeeper, fix Tethys, and that Abby may have problems. Is past Rover just a genius, or was it simply because past Rover saw the future? Why else would past Rover not want the Shorekeeper to share those memories with current Rover? Furthermore, why has Shorekeeper not intervened? She saw the future as well. Does she know that he'll turn out fine? Perhaps it was, in truth, desperation, an ending so horrific he had no other choice. Rover values human life and understands its value. Not just human life, but all life, including the Shorekeeper. The Shorekeeper isn't human. She's a remnant creature higher than even Imperator or Jue in terms of being. Though, this is not a fair comparison, as the Rover loves her. This could be a point of hypocrisy, saving the Shorekeeper, valuing her life above mankind's salvation. However, for Phrolova, he was more than willing to slay her. But let's also not forget, she started the fight. Every time they talked, she moved first, not Rover. Let's also recall, the Rover values life, and saw the Shorekeeper as someone who is sentient, breathing, capable of emotion and feeling. Would it not be a greater hypocrisy to sacrifice her to Tethys, to abandon this idea that life has value and meaning for a cold machine that would erase the humanity in mankind to save it? Rover, in truth, had no choice. Rover had to save the Shorekeeper, both for himself and the world. The Rover and the Shorekeeper are part of each other. Saving the Shorekeeper was the acceptance and acknowledgement of his past bonds and relationships, of his past self. Phrolova is the confrontation and realization that not all of them were good or positive, and that he would have to solve issues his past accidentally or intentionally created. We see, in The Lost Beyond, that there is a nostalgia filter. This is, of course, because she lives in the past. I said earlier that the Chorus Radiata represents the other shore. This is it. The Black Shores represent the future and hope. However, The Lost Beyond represents the past, nostalgia, and delusion. The song there, of course, is Phrolova's theme, speaking about Reverie. In other words, a fantasy, a daydream, a false reality. She calls out for her fantasy to dance with her, to take her hand, to never let her go, and to stay by her side. The complete and utter ignoring of reality. Of course, reality is often cruel. It involves suffering and needless fights for survival. Anger, hate, rage, grief, depression. Phrolova was too weak to face reality, but despite not being human, I think this brings her closer to being human. The temptation to sink into your own final acts, the daydreaming of a beautiful life. Phrolova is the perfect character to display my own philosophy I've been working on. More accurately, however, a perfect display of what I mean when someone is lost. As someone whose Arcadia betrayed them, as someone who's lacked a lantern. Frolova's story had me in tears when I played it through a second time to record it. I deeply love this character and believe they are, perhaps, the second best written character in the entire game thus far. If you are interested in more philosophical and less psychological takes on Frolova's character, especially revolving around the ones that I've made, then let me know in the comments down below. This place of hers is a sonorosphere. It's another reality, so to speak, but also deeply intertwined within her heart, and the memories she carries. This is why no one can ever grow or experience true change until after she succeeded in merging with it. Even in her intimacy reports, when she had died, before grabbing Hecate's hand, she already knew it was nothing but stagnation. Not even her music grew. To justify her survivor's guilt, the loss of everyone she knew. Frolova had little choice but to accept that dream she saw could become real. The dream's mere existence acts as the only justification she needs. Humans do not follow logic nor reason, they are instead slaves to an initial belief or emotion. Frolova here was no different, and I would say a perfect example of how you can use reason to reason yourself into delusion. It was the player who promised Frolova, and more than that, it was the player who offered Frolova a small bit of hope. It was the player who knew the promise was real, and who saw the context and understood Frolova. The Rover did not have that luxury. The Rover only knew she was a liar, a manipulator, murderer, and was delusional. In what reality should we have ever expected a different outcome? The tragedy of Frolova is not in what the Rover did or did not do, but in Frolova as a person. The Rover, the player, Frolova, everyone is right in what they feel. Frolova may have been wrong in every regard, but she was never wrong in how she felt. The Rover may have been wrong for erasing his memories, but he was not wrong in feeling he should. The player is not wrong in taking either side, because the target is not at truth but rather at the player's emotions. Wherever your heart lands, you are right. Feelings exist only to one person and can therefore never truly be wrong. No matter how much you try to understand, there will always be a separation between your emotion and their emotion. You have not lived their life, you are not them. That doesn't mean you shouldn't try, however. Just realize that perfection in every form is unattainable, because time moves and the past falls behind us, while the future grows nearer. Judging right or wrong is a pointless endeavor, in a world where even delusion can exist as reality. Even if brief, fleeting, and small, it still existed. When dealing with the struggle of civilization's greater good, or the bonds one makes, there is no easy choice. All that awaits, no matter the choice, is lament. Phrolova was a deeply tragic character, manipulated by the Grand Architect, used by their own ends. Deeply emotional and never reasonable. She put false premises on a promise, and worst of all, Phrolova betrayed herself. She betrayed Rover's promise, unable to see it for what it truly was. She betrayed her mind in favor of delusion. She betrayed her future in favor of the past. She betrayed her life in the present to live in death. Phrolova acts like a warning to all who dare to dream of immortality, as is perhaps the most important villain Rover has faced. According to the intimacy reports, Chrysophora wants to give mankind true free will, but I doubt it will get as personal and emotional with Rover. Perhaps more philosophical, but I think the one who did something to hurt not Rover's pride, nor his body, nor mind, but his emotions, ever so slightly, made more of an impact than even the Grand Architect. Or perhaps that was the Grand Architect's plan. Phrolova was a masterful stroke of writing geared at the player and not necessarily the Rover, building up tropes, expectations, and properly selling it to us. Having even me, someone who has been asking for Phrolova to die, shed some tears. A beautiful tragedy that makes us want to fall into our own reverie, to think, feel, and see what things might have been like if something was different. If Rover showed up every performance, if she was able to reflect on herself, if the Fraxidas weren't interested in her, if the Black Shores took her in. However, we come to the same immutable conclusion as those who are separated by several layers of non-reality. This was always her outcome, because this was always where her story would end. Yet, in that silent suffering, we still cling onto either her or Rover. A war of sorts between who was right or wrong, whom betrayed whom, not marred by reason or logic, but by emotion and attachment. The Rover was right, but no one is wrong for wanting to take Phrolova's side. No one is wrong in the feelings they have, because, after all, feelings have no reason or logic to them. If you felt betrayed by Rover, then I hope he can regain your trust in the future. If you felt Rover stood on business, then I hope he continues to respect your trust. The objective reality is that Rover was right, and his hypocrisy is overstated. But you are not wrong for feeling it is important, and you are not wrong for feeling it cutting deep. Such is the nature of life and death. No one wants to die, but more than that, no one wants to be hurt. No one wants to yearn, to long, and love, only to be left behind. This, however, was always the case. For the Rover is a wandering hero, only ever to return to the Black Shores. The fate of everyone he comes across is the same. Rover will enter into their life, change them in some way, and then vanish, all except one, the Shorekeeper. In Rover's roaming of the world, perhaps the Rover is mankind's greatest threat, in creating these broken, desperate, and fractured stars. If faced with someone who came in, offered you understanding, and then left, when it all crumbles down, would you turn to them again? Or would you turn to the only constant in the universe? No matter how cruel the lament is, it too offers an understanding, just not a whole one. The game itself wants us to feel for Phrolova, but it wants us to rationalize Rover at the same time. These two are not mutually exclusive, however, they are in fact necessary. It's oddly similar to integrating two sides of your psyche in Jungian psychology. In this case, emotion and reason. However, emotion is the far more powerful of the two. Special thanks to Takoyaki Lover, Wolfmaster256, Icy Sincere 13, and Frosty Frog for making these videos possible. I hope you all enjoyed, and I'll see you all in the next video. Until next time, keep playing your own tune in life, and smile while doing it.